Καλησπέρα λοιπόν. Καλώς ορίσατε στην απόψινή εκδήλωση στο EMST του ARCAthens. Είμαστε σε ευχάριστη θέση να φιλοξενούμε και να συνδιοργανώνουμε την εκδήλωση αυτή, την ετήσια εκδήλωση του ενός από τα πιο σημαντικά residents που γίνονται στην Αθήνα τα τελευταία χρόνια. Να σας πω πολύ σύντομα ότι ως μουσείο έχουμε και εμείς σκοπό έτσι να διοργανώσουμε μια σειρά από Curators programs που θα φέρουν ξένους επιμελητές στην Ελλάδα για την προώθηση των υλών καλλιτεχνών, artist residencies που θα έχουν τη δυνατότητα και Έλληνες καλλιτέχνες και ξένοι καλλιτέχνες να έρθουν να μείνουν στην Αθήνα και διάφορα προγράμματα που έχουν να κάνουν με την προώθηση του ελληνικού του σύγχρονου πολιτισμού. Αυτά βρίσκονται εν τη γενέση τους αυτή τη στιγμή, οπότε ελπίζουμε ότι το επόμενο διάστημα θα μπορούμε να ανακοινώσουμε και κάποια πράγματα. Θα προσκαλέσω αμέσως τον Αριστείδη Λογοθέτη, τον ιδρυτή του ARCAthens, να παρουσιάσει τους απόψινούς ομιλητές και την απόψινή βραδιά και τον καλώ αμέσως από τον λόγο.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ, Daphne. Καλώς ήρθατε όλοι σας. Θα μιλήσουμε από τώρα και στο εξής στα αγγλικά. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to ARCAthens' third public presentation here at the magnificent National Museum of Contemporary Art, which has been incredibly supportive to host us and co-organize this event. I'm Aristis Logothetis, a visual artist and founder and executive director of ARCAthens. Tonight's program will introduce you to our Fall 22 Fellows, Dr. Anita Bateman and Assaf Hinden, and will be followed by a conversation where our fellows will be joined by EMST curator Daphne Vitali, who just spoke, and curator and ARCAthens advisor Marina Fokidis. Following that, the floor will be open to questions. I first of all want to thank you for joining us on this Monday evening after the holiday weekend. And I'd also like to thank everyone who helped organize this event. This beautiful museum's director, Curatorial, and the amazing staff, particularly Sergio Zalmas and Theofilos Traboulis, who has taken this event under his caring wing. Thank you. I'd also like to thank the ARCAthens Board of Directors and Advisors, without whose support, none of this programming would be possible. And our intrepid staff, Konstantinos Kotsis, the Athens Residency Program Manager, and Paula Kamba, ARCAthens Executive Assistants. Thank you so much for everyone's contributions. Our presentation and discussion tonight take place in conjunction with ARCAthens' third residency here in Athens. Supported by people like you, ARCAthens is an artist-founded, artist-run, nonprofit organization with bases in New York City and Athens, whose mission is to immerse talented visual scholars in the Athenian community and to provide them with the financial support and structure so that they can develop and enrich their research, build cultural bridges, and cross-pollinate advanced ideas through their relationship with the Athenian community, which many of us believe is uniquely dynamic. Last time I spoke to you at the Boulangeries Museum in 2019, pre-pandemic, we joyfully acknowledged the visible and steady manifestation of a shared vision, alive in many people here in Athens, as well as in the diaspora, that Greece and Athens ought to be global centers for creation, scholarship, and academia. Even through the difficult years of the pandemic, Athens continues to grow and impress, validating its place as a nourishing environment for the arts and for ideas. ARCAthens aims to provide a positive contribution to this already energized, pulsing city, and the future looks bright indeed. And I'd like to just take a moment and acknowledge an important milestone in the growth of our organization, Open Applications. This was a foundational aspiration, but it took us a couple years to get it going. So I'm very pleased to report to you that the Fall 22 Fellows are our very first fellows that have been chosen by our new Open Application Protocol. And we're very pleased to have been able to offer free applications to 344 applicants from all over the world. This has been a major step in the growth of ARCAthens, and we're very grateful to the independent jury, legendary artist Radcliffe Bailey, ARCAthens alumna Miranda Lash, who is currently chief curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art Denver, and our very own Pocayo. Is he here? He's not here. He may be here. Who is a professor at the Athens School of Fine Arts and a founding director of the Athens Biennale. And now, without further ado, we will start with Dr. Anita Bateman, who is the recipient of the ARCAthens Curatorial Fellowship for our Fall 22 program. Dr. Anita Bateman specializes in modern and contemporary African art and the art of the African diaspora, with additional expertise in the history of photography, Black feminism, womanism, and the role of social media in activism and liberation work. Bateman earned a PhD in art history and visual culture and a graduate certificate in African and African American studies from Duke University, an MA in art history from Williams College. Wait a minute. I do not want to make a mistake, so let me start this over. Dr. Anita Bateman earned a PhD in art history and visual culture and a graduate certificate in African and African American studies from Duke University, an MA in art history also from Duke University, and a BA in art history from Williams College. She has held curatorial positions at RISD Museum, Rhode Island School of Design, the Williams College Museum of Art, and the Nasher Museum of Art. Her research has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson National Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council. Bateman currently serves as the Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and is based in Houston, Texas. So let's all welcome Dr. Anita Bateman.
Thank you, Aristides. I'm Dr. Anita Bateman. I appreciate you all for coming. And thank you to the ARCAthens team for inviting me to be the Curatorial Fellow for the fall program of this residency. And I also want to extend thank yous to the EMST organizers, particularly Academy of Ergos, Sergio Zamas, and Daphne Vitali for welcoming us in this space. And as I'm speaking, I want you to keep in mind the theme of memory, which has been the preeminent organizing principle of my work and my practice for the past 5 years. So, my academic, curatorial, and research interests have been spearheaded by my initial training as a photo historian. I wrote my dissertation on modernity and contemporary visual culture in Ethiopia, specifically attending to Black nationalism as a lens to partly understand not only how images circulate and are disseminated through the African diaspora, but also how statecraft was utilized in constructing an idealized image of the last emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie I. On the one hand, the emperor is considered a Black messiah in some communities of the African diaspora, which is refuted and thrown into contrast with the political policies he implemented in his country, which negatively impacted Ethiopians. In the photograph on screen from 1966, former Haitian President Papa Dr. Valier greets Emperor Selassie in Port-au-Prince in front of hundreds of onlookers as part of the Emperor's Grand Tour of the Caribbean. And I was drawn to this image because I'm interested in deconstructing imperial spectacle, which was meant to integrate and exclude citizens from the notion of empire. But most importantly, I wanted to understand photography as a key tool through which Black subjects have elaborated a connection to the global Black world across the 20th century. Throughout graduate school, I was curating and teaching about contemporary art at the same time, and specifically I was focusing on the ideological and affective work of photographs. And so this photograph by John Edmonds is one that I've showed my students many times, and maybe it's one that you might see the reference to, which is Man Ray's image of his lover, Kiki de Montparnasse. And so I was giving my students a glimpse into what I and a lot of scholars are deeming critical Black memory, right? And so John Edmonds, who's a queer photographer, is reinterpreting the photograph of Kiki de Montparnasse, who is very much engaged in primitive notions that are relegated through this icon of the African mask. And Kiki is someone you see sort of with her eyes closed. Also in this circle of modernism, people were really engaged in necrophilia, which was sort of this fetishization of the African continent. And so John Edmonds is turning this dynamic on its head. He's using the African mask, but in a way that is more empowered, if you will. The person in the photograph is looking directly at us, and so he's challenging this idea of gazes and what it means to be a recipient of the gaze and the confrontation of the gaze that is then interpolating a viewer, right? So I mentioned critical Black memory, and I want to spend a little time on this because it is something that is a photographic term, but it's really led my practice in a lot of ways. And so it was keyed by Lee Rayford, who's a professor of Africana Studies at UC Berkeley. And in her book, Imprisonment of Luminous Glare, she sort of elaborates on this concept, which is dedicated to understanding photography in the context of anti-lynching civil rights and Black power movements. So critical Black memory is an epistemological structure of interrogating truth claims that are assigned to ways of understanding the world. It challenges Western categorization and hegemony, which seek to marginalize Black life. It interprets memory as a disruptive intervention into history, and concurrently, history is ever present and subjective rather than something relegated to the past. It also rewrites the meaning of Black bodies in public space, and reveals the duality of photography as a historical site of manipulation and ethnographic othering, but also as a medium to be reclaimed, as John Edmonds does in the previous slide, in pursuit of understanding the Black diaspora. Photography in the case, in its original use, was a hybrid thing, a paradox which documents survival, resistance, and refusal, but also struggle, oppression, and crisis. And so this, to give you a little taste into the nuances of Africana Studies, this is something that is, Africana Studies 101, if you will. And it shows the entanglement of modernity, hybridity, multiplicity, transculturality, and conditions of the diaspora. And so I also show this chart to my students so that, the concepts that we're engaging with throughout the semester are really distilled in a way that can be visualized, because I realize a lot of people are visual learners. And so what you see on screen is a chart that is divided by regions, and it shows sort of the interconnections and networks of certain cultural products from the African diaspora and certain key figures who are then proliferating those products, disseminating those products, and also reacting to the nuances of the products and how they're traveling throughout the diaspora. So to give you an example, if you see in the middle, I wish I had a pointer, Toussaint Louverture, who is a radical Black thinker in Haiti. He is someone who is influencing Caribbean negritude, and also he is someone who is sort of put tangentially next to Marcus Garvey, even though they're not necessarily connected, right? And so you see all of these flows that are created in the diaspora in very active ways that can be, distilled very simply as well. So this is a forthcoming article that will be in NKA Journal of Contemporary Art next month. It's taken from my dissertation. And this article contextualizes the work of contemporary photographer Ida Mulune within a broader discussion of Ethiopia's recent political climate. I am arguing that Mulune is visually interpreting narratives of place, exile, and agency with particular regard to issues of displacement by showing photographic representations of Ethiopian modernity, which is structured around her own invocation of personal history in reference to Ethiopia's many ethnic groups. And so Mulune is really giving a form to visual exile. And so this image is one that is written with intertextual references. It is a reference to the Divine Comedy, specifically thinking about Dante's sorcerers who are, looking back and also looking forward in a way to sort of think about the future, but then they're punished in hell for doing that, right? And so Mulene is really taking this intertextual reference and showing the image of this model who is looking backward and forward at the same time to show a condition of modernity and the sort of the vexed nature of that both foresight and looking back in a political way. My dissertation work has also fed into what I am working on now in Athens, which is a project that I started with an architect called Where's Africa? It began as a collective and sort of went through many permutations, and now we're working on a book that will be published in January. But Where's Africa was started at RISD Museum, where we were both working at the time, I in the museum, he in the Department of Architecture. And we were really sort of disheartened by how our students felt really isolated from the disciplines in which they were trying to create art. And so a lot of critiques that they were telling us had to do with professors who weren't really understanding how to engage them because they just didn't know the vocabulary in which to talk to Black students, to African descendant students. And partly, this was made as a resource to them, but also Emmanuel and I were really grappling with how art history and visual culture has situated African subjects and objects. And so we did this as a way to really forefront people and makers and cultural thinkers who were at the vanguard and are at the vanguard of their respective practices. So we brought these three iconic figures who are in the book to RISD Museum to do a panel. Salome Asega, Delphine Fawundo, and Iyama Safia Sandu, who I will talk about later, but this was the first iteration of our doing something at the museum for their project. And so it took us to many places, one of which is Addis Ababa. Oh, thank you. Where Emmanuel is from. Emmanuel is in the center of the picture on the right, so that is the architect whom I'm writing the book with. And we went to Zoma Museum in Addis, which is a sustainable museum, engaging the contemporary art scene there. And what's interesting about this place is that it is made completely out of sustainable materials using ancient Ethiopia building techniques. And so the architecture you see is what I was just describing. It's something that is very climate controlled, but the artist who did these buildings is Elias Sime, who is the figure on the right. And so we were very interested in talking to both Elias and Ms. Karuma Segwed, who you see also, who is the director of the museum, and they're also in the Where's Africa book. While we were there, we engaged with a lot of artists and did studio visits around Addis, one of which was with Rebel Temeskin, who was interested in thinking about the rituals around coffee ceremony in Ethiopia, which is very much a cultural practice. And so what you see on screen is a Jabena pot, which is part of this series where he's unpacking the symbols that have to do with Ethiopian cultural communal gatherings in Jabena pot specifically. We also went to Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar in Tanzania. And Emmanuel, who's an architect, was wanting to really think about how marketplaces are not only transactional, but how the open air marketplace in Dar es Salaam really mirrors or parallels the open air residency spaces that are offerings to artists in Tanzania. So what you see on the left is Kariakoo Market in the center of the city, and that is put in juxtaposition with Nafasi Art Space in Dar es Salaam, which acts as a place where up to 25 artists at one time are in residence and have space for their studios. Some of these images I'm showing for the very first time, they will be in the book. And this is an image by Delphine Fawundu, who I showed in the slide with the panel. And Delphine is someone who is really interested in bearing witness to history. And so she's using her figure of the back of her head specifically as a way to be an interlocutor on history, specifically United States history. And so you have a lot of colonial references that Daphne is using. And also key sort of American events that are speaking about the trauma on American soil. And so she is really interpolating these events as someone who can intervene on them. And this was from a show that she actually collaborated with Niama with. This image is also in the book. It's from Eric Gottesman's The Last Days of Balu Girma. So Balu Girma was an Ethiopian journalist who secretly wrote the Oromaye, which was a novel about the communist Ethiopian government's Red Star campaign to defeat the Eritrean Liberation Front, or Eritrean People's Liberation Front. And 10 days after Balu Girma published this book, he went missing, and he's been disappeared ever since. And so, 5 months later, or 5 months after Balu Girma disappeared, his family really was trying to implement ways to try to find him, but the Oromaye is still widely read today in Ethiopia. And so Eric was really interested in restaging the conditions of Balu Girma's life. And so what you see is an actor who's impersonating Girma, personifying Girma, and it's taken in a series of photographs that Eric has done in order to bring light to the story, which he's translated into English now. And there's Eric below. This talk was part of a show I curated called Former Glory at RISD Museum, which was wanting to think about the American flag and how people had used the flag, artists specifically, as a way to reposition ideas about nationalism and civic duty in the realm of art. And I love this slide because you can also see Tasha Duje, who I invited to this conversation, who is also an ARCAthens Fellow. So we unwittingly didn't know we would be in a cohort together, but I think this project, Former Glory, was significant because it was the first I did at RISD Museum. At the same time I was working as a curatorial fellow, I had an independent practice and was chosen to work with Carrie Mae Weems in a cohort in Detroit, where we mounted 2 shows, one of which was in the Havana Biennial. And that show was called The Spirit That Resides. But we did a second show called Beyond Space that happened in Detroit. And that show was really meant to think about spiritualism, transcendence, and how artists in the Detroit community were responding to different themes and concerns that were situated in Detroit. And so Miata Kawinzi, who's a Liberian American artist, did an installation called Gathering Space, which you can see on screen. And the show also had a performance to end the exhibition by Jennifer Harge, who is a choreographer and very much someone who is situated in Detroit, called Fly Drown. And what Jennifer did was really beautiful because she reconstructed her childhood home and made it sort of a place where she had a performance to her childhood. And Fly Drown was then sort of reimagined in a different way for the Beyond Space show. The show that I did after that was called Roots and Roads, and it was something that I'm very much still proud of because it was pushing an envelope that I was trying to think through in terms of cultural products, media intervention, and also how Black hair culture is really present in a lot of ways in the United States, but maybe not necessarily targeted as such. And so Roots and Roads was drawing parallels to this idea of roots, being roots as in hair, but also trade routes, and how there are very much similarities between the two. And it took its inspiration from the legacies of African women who would braid seeds and rice in their hair before they were kidnapped in order to ensure that they would be able to eat and to also feed their children. So even in the midst of being enslaved, these women were very much, almost entrepreneurial in how they were thinking. They were ahead of, the game, even in the midst of intense tragedy. And so I wanted to really bring that legacy into bear and how contemporary artists were thinking about their hair. And on the right, you see Daphne again. She did this video called The Cleanse, in which her natural hair is transforming before our very eyes. And so she's getting her hair wet in that video. And it's really a beautiful, poetic reinterpretation of what her hair can do. This is one of my favorite images from the show. It's from Jay Simple's Whites Only series. And so Jay is showing and offering commentary on racial relations and identity politics, and also referencing history in a very subtle way. And so the Grand Wizard's Bridge was taken as part of a body of work that looks at ideas and legacies that came out of the civil rights movement. And this image was created at the National Voting Rights Museum and Institute in Selma, Alabama. And the work depicts a young white girl who's pulling the hair of a mannequin whose back is to the viewer. And the confrontation is on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is named after the Grand Wizard of the KKK who served as a U.S. Senator. And so you get that Jay is collapsing multiple temporalities in this image, because had I not told you that these were mannequins, you would have maybe had a couple of questions. But I was really interested in the nuances about, even in this innocent act, seemingly of this, white child showing curiosity is very much already showing like nascent ideas about otherness and how she's approaching this mannequin, which is a little sad, to be honest. There were two video works in the show, one of which I'm showing now. Julian Knox is a Sierra Leonean, and he now works and lives in London. And so he created this lyric poem of moving images to talk about the personal and symbolic significance of hair as a marker of ancestral identity. And so he was giving particular attention to the history of locks in the Caribbean and parts of Africa. And this video was originally commissioned for a performing arts space in London, but it was readapted to be in the show. And I'm very pleased to show you some of it if we have time. But if not, the video for the entire work is online if you remember to look it up. This work, Alindi, is thinking through the relationship of the hand to the body, of the politics of labor within craft and adornment. And it's also meditating on the action of braiding as a particularly potent movement and moment of Black intimacy, often experienced and performed between femme, mother, and daughters, and is viscerally queer in its eroticness. And Nadia Wolf, who is a non-binary Haitian American artist, is performing this act of queer intimacy on the right. And so Nadia had a vision to create a cape that would then be active the night of the performance by virtue of her or them using a model in this sort of very intimate act of braiding. And when the performance was over, this cape was hung on a chair so people can look at the images that you see detailed on the left. My curatorial practice also has been sort of translated into the public programs that I'm interested in doing and have facilitated in the past. And so during the pandemic, I convened a few programs, including this one with Jay Simple, who's the artist who did the Grand Wizard's Bridge. He's the one next to me. But this was a program that I did for my alma mater, Duke University, Revolutionary Practices of Black Photographers. I tried to keep busy during the pandemic, and so I was also curating and facilitating other panels and public programs virtually. And some of my favorites I've put here. In the center, the brick conversation building anti-racist organizations. This was one of the first times that I was able to converse with Larry Osenmensa, who's an ARCAthens Fellow. Hopefully some of you may have met him while he was here. And Larry and I really clicked, and so he invited me to moderate a show he did in my hometown of Memphis, Tennessee, called On the Road Chocolate Cities, and so I did a facilitation on his request. I also did a couple of things with the Black Artists Designers Guild, where we talked about this broader concept of a chocolate city, which is, in the context of the US, a city where there was a predominantly Black population, but that has now been subsumed by gentrification efforts. And so chocolate cities are such like Detroit, Washington, DC, Los Angeles, and so on and so forth, which are no longer chocolate cities. And on the very right, I'll talk about that later, but this is from a show called Black Fly that I also curated at RISD Museum. And it was taken from a conversation that I had with the artist Sophia Allison. All right, Define the Shadow is sort of my baby project. And I say that because it was really convening a lot of theoretical concerns that was coming out of Du Boisian double consciousness. And so for those of you who are interested, W.E.B. Du Bois really became well known for this sociological concept of double consciousness, by which African descended people in the US and across the diaspora were always engaging on two levels in which they are meant to embody a persona, if you will. And that's also something that is internalized or endowed with who they may really be. And so this idea of being a double is foregrounded in this conceptual split or schism between someone who presents a certain way and someone who then has to present a different way or feel that they are, of two minds, if you will. And so Define the Shadow was really engaging images of Black artists and Black figures that resist the consumptive impulses of looking. And as anti-portraits, they challenge the impulse to be known, comprehended, categorized, and easily identified. And so I was really thinking about what it means to operate in a surveillance-based state and also operate under the constant threat and risk of violence, specifically in 2020, and how people can engage with this body of work without feeling re-traumatized by being in a museum space. And so I went to Du Bois, and I also went to Sojourner Truth's abolitionist portraits, where she has on carte de visite, I sell the shadow to support the substance, meaning I will sell the image of myself in order to further accelerate the abolitionist movement. And so that split between what she did for her political concerns, her political trajectory, and how she then, could sell her body in a very metaphorical way, was really interesting to me in contextualizing surveillance and what it means to gaze upon, a Black figure in the contemporary art space. The show was very limited in its didactics, and I did that intentionally. And instead I offered this publication, which sort of operated as an exhibition catalog for the show. And it showed not only works in the exhibition, but thinking about different theoretical concerns that drove the show. And this is an imprint catalog, but it's also a free PDF, so people can, access it, on the internet. I also did this reading list / syllabus, which was meant to really foreground the concerns of the show, but also talk through some of the questions that I had, coming into it. And so I'm still grappling with some of the things I learned just researching what I wanted to talk about with showing, Black bodies in public space and how to do that with care, because there is a tendency to maybe reinscribe a lot of problematic dynamics by showing work that is not necessarily really delving into the subjectivity of the figures in question. And so I wanted this to be a way that people could also understand the work and think about critical race theory, which is a discipline that is thinking about intersectionality of different things that are affecting the African diaspora, specifically in the United States, like criminalization, political inequality, systemic racism, and so on. In the show, for the first time, I was able to show this body of work, and it is from the Peter J. Cohen collection. And so Peter J. Cohen is a New York-based collector who, over the past 2 decades, has accumulated almost 60,000 photographs. And he's divided them into 130 categories. In his apartment, he has these boxes of photographs. And so I went to his apartment one day, and for the day, just sat with a lot of these, images, and I ended up choosing 100 of them, and 40 of them made it into the show. So I'll just cycle through them really quickly. But part of what I was trying to do is really address this gap in the RISD Museum's collection of early 20th century vernacular photography and show subjects who were really, empowered in their anonymity, but also question this idea about erasure and what it means to operate in the shadow, right? And so on the one hand, the shadow theoretically is a place of refuge. It is a place where Black people found safety, and it was also a place that was very vexed because of those very reasons. There is very much systems that would erase people who you can't necessarily see, but at the same time, those people are hyper visible. So this idea of the shadow is really thinking about all of those questions I had, and I actually was trying to put Easter eggs in the show. So I was throwing in pictures that had actual shadows in them to see if people would catch them and unpack them for themselves. And lastly, or second to lastly, if we have time, I'll talk about Black Fly, which was a show that was in the same museum as Defying the Shadow. But where shadow was really much entrenched in a lot of the theoretical concerns that I mentioned, Black Fly was lighter, quite literally. It was talking about transcendence and how Black people across the diaspora have used this word fly to connote a lot of things, not only their originality and stylistic choices, but also how there's a legacy of this idea of flying that is really part of some of our cultural sayings, our cultural lexicon. And Sophia had created a beautiful short film that I had in the show, along with 6 other short films and videos. And if we have time, I would like to show you a bit of it.
For everyone that's joining today, I feel so honored to be in community with everyone. I will just say that this short film is a video essay, using written text, using my own personal memories to find the language to explore what it means to understand a truth that is not visible, it's not tangible, and what that process of excavation looks like.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I remember the first time my body was weightless and free, floating past the heavens, slipping into the ether, transcending time and space. A conjuring so powerful, I felt my spirit force itself free from the body, dancing to the rhythm of the wind, surrendering to the air, allowing the spirit to move as it pleases. Memories, not my own, surrounding me. Voices, familiar and distant, navigating my movement. They say the people could fly, Black folks. From slave narratives to folklore, they would lift right off the ground and fly back to Africa. They possessed a magic so rich, so deep that it had been forcibly buried, wings clipped. But these stories are birthing their way to the surface, fiercely erupting the soil around them. Through these ancestral memories, where does fiction and myth become fact and dreaming a reality?
The one thing you say about a myth is that there's some truth in there, no matter how bizarre they may seem. And the one that I had always heard that seemed like just a child's wish was one about black people, black slaves, who came to the United States. And under certain circumstances, they would fly back to Africa. When I looked at it more closely, I read a lot of those slave narratives, that they published in the 30s. And the interviewer would ask certain basic questions, and then he or she always asked that. Have you ever heard of flying Africans? Or people taking up and flying back to Africa? And everybody said one or two things. No, I never saw any, but I heard about it.
Yes.
Or they said, they had me.
All right, I think I'll end there, but I would want to say one thing having to do with this concept of the flying African, which is presented by Toni Morrison as this very whimsical idea that's sort of ridiculous. But it's also something that was, meant to hide the very troubling nature of plantation economies in the U.S., right? And so when you think about people flying back to Africa, that was often used as a metaphor, or a euphemism rather, for people who have committed suicide or taking autonomy of their own bodies and either left or unalived themselves in ways that are indescribable. And so with this concept of flying, now I wanted to present this levity in this moment where in the gallery space, shadow was very much overbearing, but also the way that Sophia and these other artists in the show really engaged this question of bodily autonomy and spirituality and transcendence, I think was really beautiful. And so I will pass it on to Aristides, and I appreciate your attention.
Thank you so much for this presentation. And I thought I knew a little about your work. I've learned so much even just from this. Of course, I loved seeing Larry, ARCAthens, our inaugural ARCAthens Fellow that we brought to Athens, and Tasha. Tasha Duje was on our last virtual residency over the summer of just this last summer. Next, we move on to Assaf. I would like to introduce Assaf Hinden, the recipient of the ARCAthens Visual Art Fellowship for our Fall 22 program. Assaf Hinden is a visual artist working with photography and video, currently based in Tel Aviv and Antwerp. Hinden obtained an MA from the Royal College of Fine Arts in Antwerp and his BFA from the Basilok Academy of Arts and Design in Jerusalem. Recent grants and fellowships include the 2021 recipient of the Lucy Art Residency in Kavala, right here in Greece, and the Roger de Connick Emerging Photographer Prize of the King Baudouin Foundation in Belgium 2021. Also curator, Hinden curated several exhibitions, among them Last Call in 2020, No Rainbows Without Rain in 2019, and he curated the show Talking Bones in 2017. In addition to his solo shows at WTA Gallery in Barcelona in 2017 and Art Space in Tel Aviv in 2018, Hinden has exhibited his work in various institutions in 2022, such as Platform Photo Museum Winterthur and Photoforum Pasquart. They're both in Switzerland, and in the Benaki Museum's Athens Photo Festival. In addition, Hinden has exhibited in Israel's the Ramat Gan Museum of Art and Photo Museum in Antwerp, both in 2021, Madrid's Hybrid Art Fair, Tel Aviv's Braverman Gallery, and Berlin's Rathaus Gallery, Reinickendorf in 2019. He has also exhibited in 2018 in Tel Aviv's Fresh Paint Art Fair. That's all. Welcome, Assaf Hinden.
try something? Is it okay?
We're gonna do this.
Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Mic? Yeah. Okay, just a moment, please. Well. So, thank you everybody for coming today. It's really nice to see a full house. And I would also like to thank Aristides and everybody that made ARCAthens possible. And to Atopos CDC for hosting us in the most generous and warm way. So it's always a question on how to start to introduce yourself or your work. And today I thought to begin with a recent photography work that was made as part of my stay here in Athens. It is a collage work made out of photographs I captured from several sites. Some of you might recognize the backdrop of the Cycladic Museum. This is the wallpaper there, it's not a collage of mine. So I'm a visual artist working mainly with photography and mixed media, while also using different image making tools, including video, collage, activation of archival materials, and also time-based technologies such as 3D modeling and AI. In my recent projects, I explored themes surrounding provenance, source, and evolution of art, while also questioning the photographic source as a documentary testimonial authority. And by activating archival materials, both private and public, as you will see later on, I'm addressing different questions regarding the role of the archive, preservation, and the manipulation of images, and therefore of meanings. So today I will discuss different works that are engaged with identity questions through the examination of objects and artifacts. And I will also delve into the different approaches for image-based works, and reflect on the shifting status of photography nowadays. So I will start with this one from 2018. The name is Nimrod, Jerusalem. The original sculpture was made by Yitzhak Danziger in 1939, and it is a landmark in the history of Israeli art. One can say the short history of Israeli art. Nimrod is a biblical character who was described as a mighty hunter before the Lord, with a falcon on his shoulder and his weapon as his backbone, who basically aims to overthrow God. So there's a lot to say about the original work, but in our context I will add that in Hebrew the name Nimrod stands from the word to rebel, Nimrod, Mered, Nimrod. I documented the original sculpture at the Israel Museum from two different angles, as you can see I merged them together, and also erased the backdrop of the museum. I erased the Israel Museum. I'm just making this pause, sorry. So the overall interest in the original sculpture is connected to its local symbol to masculinity. As an important attempt to bring into physical form a representation of the Jewish body, not as a persecuted one, not as a student of the yeshiva, maybe the new Jew, as a symbol of a warrior or maybe a soldier, if you will. On the right is the original sculpture. So let's pause this. This photograph was made in 2017 during a residency in Barcelona. In my studio, where I projected images and photographed them at night. The search for material within the digital sphere, as well as the transition between medium, are a part of my overall reflection on photography. You will witness it today. And in the context of exploring the fluidity in my practice in photography, I'm sharing this work, Soldier, Selfie. What you see here is a documentation of the physical work, okay? So this is an outcome of my collaboration with the Swiss artist Jean-Marie Fahy in 2020. It started from a quick sketch by Jean-Marie that was made during his visit to Israel and the West Bank. The original drawing was based on a profile picture in a gay dating app, Grindr, that shows different users based on your location. He drew the profile picture of an anonymous naked soldier photographing his own reflection in the mirror while concealing his groin area with his M16 rifle. I transformed Jean-Marie's sketch into an object made from engineered wood of a headless sculpture that is both physical and hollow, where its lines function almost as shifting borders or territories. And in the context of our presentation, I will also explain a little bit about the origin of some works coming from a country where the majority of its population stems from the immigration of Jews from the diaspora, influenced my gaze towards various cultural representation and symbols while addressing their past origins and remains. Again, I was born in Israel, just to be clear on that. On the left is the photography work, David Jerusalem, combining different found materials, a broken vase, 3D sculpture, sorry guys, I'm a bit excited here, as you can see. So, a broken vase, concrete block 10, and 3D printed vase in the form of David. Thanks God that I have some notes. And this is an installation, okay? So it's not an installation, it's a image, a two-dimensional image on the left. And on the right is a collage combining different tourist postcards. The backdrop is a postcard from the late 19th century, accommodating tourists to visit Palestine. As an additional example for the formal research, I can share this work which started from a found material. It is a textile catalog from 1907 in Paris. I scanned the handmade sample as I would have scanned a film negative, which allowed me to reveal in very high quality the traces of the working hand, as well as the material's quality decay and its loose threads. So this is the view of an installation work album. It is a concrete tomb where inside there's a monitor playing a video of my hands flipping pages in old family albums that were not made in Israel. And in the context of this presentation, it is worth to briefly mention my family's background. My parents come from mixed cultural origins, as many Israelis do. My mother immigrated from Morocco to Israel, while my father's family of German Jews fled the war. And in relation to that, I'm showing this work, Rehovot, which is named after the city where my grandmother used to live and where this image was captured. I documented this tapestry piece, which she immigrated with from Morocco to Israel, together with a few things they chose to bring with them. And I chose to show this image as an additional thought about dealing with immigration and identity through objects in the charged context of colonialism, which is quite directly portrayed in the original tapestry scene. And from another end, I'm showing this work from 2016 entitled Tag. The work is a sketch by my late German grandfather that is based on a photograph of a group of deceased friends and family members from interwar Germany. In the sketch, he basically tagged the names of the participants in the original photo in a peculiar act of preservation for that time, which almost echoed to our era of social media. Usually I'm not showing the original image, but I thought it would be interesting to show it here. It took me some time to connect the sketch to this image, and you can see like the placement of the people. I thought it might be interesting. And in the context of our location, Greece, I'm sharing a part of a series that I documented in a memorial site for Holocaust victims of Thessaloniki. It is located on the basement floor of an elderly nursing home in Petah Tikva, which is a peripheral city in Israel. Surprisingly, this is the only memorial and heritage site dedicated to the victims of Thessaloniki. It functions every day of the week, but it's not a well-known site. It's almost a hidden one in a sense. The on-site display contained an array of life-size cardboard figures, anonymous people, hundreds of undated photographs, and endless objects without any mapping, order, or logic. So while spending time there, I came to realize that many of the exhibits are purely stage replicas, almost functioning as props. So the coexistence of the authentic and the fictional and the replicated invited some critical thoughts about the way different institutions mediate history and knowledge. I will briefly go through a past exhibition of mine from 2018, Relative Humidity. The title referred to the technical term of the precise relation between temperature and humidity in order to protect archaeological exhibits or findings. So the exhibition re-examined different artworks from 4 museums, including the British Museum, the Israel Museum, the Museum for Islamic Art in Jerusalem, and a peripheral nature museum in the north of Israel. While focusing on the exhibit's origin and journey, the exhibition reimagined a new collection that is not bound to a disciplining mapping system, hierarchy, or tradition. The series was photographed from the perspective of every visitor or tourist without any unique access to the artifacts, almost emphasizing the never-ending option of appropriation and replication. As part of the show, there was a video work of this character that recited these guidelines for how to properly display and preserve past findings. And it was an existing text, found text from a guidebook by the British Museum. And the exhibition was accompanied by a catalogue of critical essays by Dr. Noah Chazan and Yael Klein relating to the exhibition's work, as well as to the multicultural approach and politics of identities in the museum system. This is the last one of them. And I will go through my latest project, a parallel chronicle from 2021, which I was also fortunate to show here at the Benaki Museum as part of Athens Photo Festival, the last edition. The project refers to a historical event in the art market which occurred in Berlin, Germany. In 1937, works owned by a Jewish art collector and philanthropist, Emma Budge, were placed up for forced auction in Nazi Germany, against her will, of course. And until this day, many pieces remain missing. So this is the case of one of the largest private art collections that were forced auction during the Nazi regime. And I collaborated with the provenance researcher of this collection, Dr. Eyal Dolet, which allowed me to obtain archival materials that I worked with. So here on the left, you can see the original press release of the auction, and on the right, the collection's stamps and signatures. So one of the works in the project, Parrot, demonstrates the motivation to reimagine or recreate a missing artifact from the collection. Here, I digitally sculpted a model which is based on an image from the art auction catalog that I worked with. So here on the right, you can see the original artifact, which is a miniature porcelain. And on the left, a view from the show. So this is actually a 2-dimensional image, right? It's not 3D. In this example, you can see on the right the digital skeleton of one of the objects that I worked with. I'm sharing this because it was important for me to reveal the process as part of the final work. So what I did here, for instance, I placed the skeleton on top of the found footage and kind of recreated this meeting point between times. So throughout the project, I sampled, manipulated, and reconstructed archival materials, but also referred to the original auction catalog that offered all these looted artifacts. So I created a series of images of a parallel catalog that is based on the original auction one. So those are actually framed images of various double spreads. But in fact, this is a fictional, hyper-realistic book that was created with 3D tools. Inside of this made-up book, I planted my own visual interventions to the collection. So if it's a bit complex, here's a small example of the process of recreating this catalog. And this is how it was shown in the exhibition. So one of the elements that influenced these processes was to create a visual dialogue between the past and the present, but also between facts and speculations, what is the original and what is the replicated. And the series is presented in a way that almost hides the layers of complexity, having in mind a way to challenge the way we approach or even read an image. This is one of the installation views. And the final work from this project was created from one of the auction's documents, originally in German, specifying technical information on the auctioned works. Using software, I erased specific letters from the document and kept this sentence: "The worst thing that can happen is not to be used for anything or by anyone." And this work functioned almost as a riddle in space, but also framed a thought or an idea about ownership and appropriation. And in the exhibition space, it was really interesting to see visitors going towards this work and trying to kind of solve it. And for the end of the presentation, I decided to share a glimpse of a current work I'm developing during my stay here in Athens. It is untitled at the moment, so if anybody has a thought, please. Oh, you don't have the cards. So this is a notebook from 1932 of my grandfather from when he was 15 years old in interwar Germany. The notebook contains plans to build a camera and a darkroom. So it is filled with calculations and sketches of non-functional optical devices. And if you'll bring your attention to the left page, you can see the development of the activation and performing on the documents, which basically aim to bring into physical form these plannings as 3D objects in space. So this is a simulation of these that structure. I'm also exploring the material of the formal aspects and the formal aspects of the notebook with the motivation to create made-up landscapes and territories. So by using 3D modeling software, I'm transforming the notebook paper into some kind of surface of an abstract land. The mold of the paper functions as a living organism in this imaginary landscape. This, for instance, like the pencil. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Assaf. This very evocative presentation and the work, the body of work you're developing in Athens is really fascinating to me as well. Thank you for sharing that. And I would like to invite both fellows to have a seat up here on this stage. Assaf and Anita, you can come up and seat yourselves and be joined by tonight's co-panelists. Two deeply thoughtful and vigorous Athenian curators whom you may well know. The person that introduced me actually from EMST curatorial team, Daphne Vitali, whom ARCAthens has had the pleasure to work with during our inaugural residency, and who has curated the Antonis Pitas exhibition up now in the museum. That's a really wonderful exhibition. And Marina Fokidis, the one and only, whom you may know is a very active independent curator. She's the founder of Kunsthal Athena and South as a State of Mind, amongst many, many other things. We're grateful to Marina for also serving on the ARCAthens Advisory Council. Welcome, everyone. And to the audience, we will be taking your questions after they've had a chance to have a little chat with each other. Thank you so much.
Let's see if this is working. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Batista.
Okay. Μπορείτε να μ' ακούσετε. Στο πράσινο δεν πρέπει να είναι.
There's also this.
Yeah.
Μπορώ να χρησιμοποιήσω την
We'll edit this part out.
Okay, so I will start immediately with a few questions so that you have also the time to ask. But thank you very much for your presentations. It was really interesting to see what you're doing and hear more from you. So I will start by asking a question to Anita Bateman. So, Anita, in a time when institutions, curators, and the art market is turning towards rethinking, studying, and presenting the work artists from the African diaspora, do you think there could be any risks involved in this celebration of African American artists? And do you think that the very use of the label Black art is instead a form of imposed isolation to those artists? Which are the issues, anyhow, that a curator of contemporary art has to be careful about when organizing a show with artists from an African descent? And finally, do you find it problematic, a white curator, to organize an exhibition showcasing the work of Black artists?
That's a doozy. I think I'll start with the first of the four subsets of the question. But I think there is a real risk, as you say, of African American artists, African diasporic artists becoming fetishized in the art world, in the contemporary art market. And so there, even now you can see that there is a very real and intrinsic way that art makers are being divorced from their art making. And so there is a reception to Black art that is divorced from how people are receiving Black people, which is very much problematic. And so if you cannot celebrate both parts of that equation, of course that differential will create problems. The second part of your question about if Black art is isolationist, I think it depends, right? I am someone who uses Black art interchangeably with art of the African diaspora, and I do that to show the multiplicity of experiences and the expansiveness of that categorization, which, if you're talking about Black art, has the risk of being flattened or not as engaging in terms of showing, the regionality, the globalization, and all the many facets of what that might mean. And so, I'm very much vexed by that categorization because on the one hand, it's a generalization, as are many generalizations, such as Asian art, contemporary art, modern contemporary art. But at the same time, it does have a specificity that I think is useful because it shows a nuanced interpretation of Blackness. So Black art can be, a lot of things. It can be art by Black people. It can be art that addresses certain circumstances that is shared across the diaspora. But I also think that in talking about Black art, there is that very real possibility of ghettoizing it to something that is sort of tangential, marginalized to history. The third part of your question, I'm trying to remember, it was something about white curators.
How do you...
Also, at the risk of being essentialist, I think anyone can work with anyone. But the reality is, I don't know if a lot of white people have deconstructed their own whiteness or decolonized their own thinking to not do harm to the people for whom they are supposed to care. And so you see this play out in a lot of ways. You see that not only are there misunderstandings about the cultural significances of the art, but even coming into a place where someone feels antagonized by their identity goes both ways, right? So there's a very real circumstance of trust already being left off the table because of the systemic issues of the political realities that are coming from possibly two places and people operating in different power structures or operating in different positions of power. And I give this example that I will tell about there needing to be trust. And even as a curator, I am someone who is wanting to amplify the work of Black artists and coming up against the wall of how to do that. And for instance, there was an incident while I was here where, a year ago I had a conversation with this white art advisor whose family has an organization. And we were talking about Black abstraction and our interest in moving past this idea of the Black body, operating in space, because this is thrown around a lot, like the Black body this, the Black body that. And so I was talking about my interest in thinking about Black abstraction as a remedy to sort of, parse through these issues. And 2 weeks ago, I got an email from this guy, a white guy, who's like, oh, I have this show called Black Abstraction, and it was my idea. And so, I felt that my trust was violated, and I know this happens repeatedly in the art world where people aren't opening up, or people don't have that foundation of a relationship in order to understand each other. And I think the risk of a white curator operating in a dynamic that can potentially harm a Black artist is very much a real possibility. The fourth thing you said, I do not remember, but
It's all right.
all right. But thank you for that question. I think it's very nuanced.
Okay. 1 minute. Let's see if this works.
As well? Yeah?
Yeah.
Good. Well, this worked. So thank you very much for your compelling talks. It was amazing. Thank you for having us here. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you, Ernst. Thank you, everyone. And it was interesting to hear you both, and now briefly also in Atopos, and hear how much the notions of loss and memory play in both of your works, and also to trying to make out where are the boundaries for that we should not transpass or to start from. Just to tell you, it's interesting to speak from, I like to speak from specific vantage points, and I'm speaking from the vantage point of a Greek, and from this place. Boundary, oreo in Greece, means also a barrier that you should not over transpass, but also a beginning. So something you start from. So something that is very much in my mind for both of you, and we can start with Assaf and then maybe go to Anita, as I don't have specific questions, is how do we, what Lord says, redefine our differences so as to celebrate them together? And this is a quote from Audre Lorde. And how do we start from this boundary for reparation, for all these kind of processes that might somehow bring our shared intensities on a table to be healed or not healed, but to be discussed. So this is a little bit, and then I have a second part of the question that I prefer to do it in a kind of a conversational mode.
I think I need to think about it a little bit. Maybe you already have an answer for this. I'm not sure. Maybe.
That's a good question. I mean,
where do I can simplify if it's better for you? Is it better to simplify?
No, it's okay. I think I understand. But I think, the idea of enforcing boundaries is somehow deemed in a negative light a lot of times, or in a lot of ways, but that is subsequently being reclaimed in order to talk about differences. And so asserting one's boundaries, both in the artistic field and as a matter of self-care, is necessary. But I think also to your question about sort of bridging differences in order to
redefine our differences. Basically, what Audre Lorde was saying is how to as an answer to globalization that homogenize everything, and and we know very much that once you start homogenizing clusters of people is where fascism also operates and separates people. So Audre Lorde was saying how to redefine these differences that we have and celebrate them together. Find ways to celebrate.
Not to go against the great Lord, but I think it's not necessarily
not Lord, right?
The great Audre Lorde, of course.
But
I think that it maybe isn't necessarily a a question of redefining differences. I think differences very much are not respected in a lot of ways. And so even starting from, like I mentioned before, cultural respect makes a world of difference when you're talking about differences. And I also think that, the idea of thinking through differences doesn't have to be a teleological goal. So if, to think through a difference means to come at some sort of reconciliation that isn't, a possibility at that moment. Talking about differences has to be, thought about in a certain way. And I think, people are apt to jump the gun in terms of wanting to talk about differences as a way to, ultimately come together. But sometimes you have to sit in it. You have to sit in the discomfort with someone potentially misunderstanding you. You have to sit in the discomfort of, maybe one racial group not forgiving another. You have to sit in all of those ideological embroiled ways that differences show up in people's, real lives. Apart from this theoretical thing, and I think that's harder to do when people know that maybe there is some sort of impossibility of the thing. That's my first.
Yeah.
And
I just very shortly about that. That I think that it's a different question for a curator or for an artist a little bit, because I believe that as any artist their starting point is to put aside all those boundaries and all these kind of territories that you don't want to fall into. And after that, yes, there's the aftermath of exhibiting it and editing it. But I feel like it's a pretty good question for from the curatorial kind of way that has to, the curatorial point of view, that has to take existing things and understand what are the implications of them.
I mean, even in your art, to go a bit to you, Assaf, in your art practice, I take one of the projects now, I don't remember the title, but let's say the book about the auction with looted objects, right? That's what it was about, and I hope so you tend to complexify the process of reparation with this looting, right? You enter in there with your own work, you somehow complexify the book, it's by itself a very complex process. Of course, it means loss, it means looting, it means a lot of other things but you have a way of, so I wanted to, if you can describe us in that way, you also, create a kind of a theoretical trajectory for yourself of how you work.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate a little bit on this?
Just a little bit, yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good actually.
I'm sorry.
It's good. The complexity that you're referring to, like the process, I guess that it stands from a different place of being kind of in a love-hate relationship with photography, and to love it and to be frustrated about it, and how can I have an interesting process and hopefully the viewer understands it without understanding what's happening there. It's not important for me that the viewer will know, okay, this is a fake book, this is that. But I do believe that the viewer kind of feels or senses that something is off, something is weird. And he has the option to go and read about the process if he wants. But I would like the people, the viewers, not to feel like obligated to understand this complexity, just to hopefully feel that something is, something is.
That's actually a wonderful metaphor, because it's so hard to understand the complexity, if I may say, of Holocaust, and the complexity of looted objects, of people that they were sent to death because of their culture and religion and all of this. So it's a very apt metaphor, that's why. And now this is to both of you also for discussion, and we can, since I said before about boundary, and boundary is a beginning, boundary is a boundary, and we heard both of you working with the museums, and there is a lot of talk recently In Documenta 15, there was a lot of talk, but also in Germany about people not collaborating with people with Nazi descent or anti-Semitic. And so I want also to somehow open up this to the Black Holocaust, let's put it that way, and ask you where the band, as we are three people from South, you know, the American South with its particularities, South Mediterranean with its particularities, South Europe with its particularities, so we all understand in between the complexity of location. So I wanted to ask also both of you, how do you operate, since you're very concerned about your practice within these boundaries? For example, to what extent you collaborate with people that they might have had ancestors that they were like really harmed, or for example in the American South, what about the boards of the museums you're working, to what extent you would somehow collaborate with boards? You see a lot of this. I mean, many people were implicated in the slave trade in the States, specifically on the South. So this is for both of you, and how do you feel about that? There are many artists that are withdrawing their work, let's say, from collectors with Nazi background in their family or situations like that. So where are your boundaries in that way?
I think, it does get to the impossibility of reparations, which is what I was trying to say before, about that having to be a real succession of power. And with board dynamics, luckily enough, I'm not as embroiled with that world as other higher up people in the organization. My cultural practice, my restorative justice for the artists to whom I'm indebted, is for there to be a way in which to minimize that harm. Because at this point, the potential of eradicating it is very slim. Mm-hmm. And I say that honestly. And it's because you have this very real paradox of people who are coming from these wealthy families in the U.S. who are on these boards, who, for good or ill, are demanding things from the institution, and the institution is responding to those demands. But also, we have a voice to respond to those demands as well, so we can push back against those voices. But I also think, the nature of museum work is already inherently so violent that, to disengage it would take the death of the museum. It's really a violent construction. It's very much something that maybe is beyond repair, to be honest. And I have that, that tension within myself being a curator in a museum. For a long time, I had an independent practice while I was in museums, just to step outside of them in order to fully ground myself in what the liberation work I want to do looks like. And I think that, there are people in positions that can, toe the line in a very real way. So that even if you're operating within these very unequal systems, there are ways to tread water in them. And so being in the U.S., very violent place, very much entrenched in not only colonial violence, but a very particular way in which enslavement and genocide has founded that place, right? But then there are people who are operating in that place and have to operate in that place. And so it's not only about survival, of course, that's partly it, but it's finding ways in order to fully ground and empower yourself, knowing that there's always these systems of power that are operating in various ways. And that isn't to say that these systems of power don't do good in some senses. Like, museums, I think, are great places. I work in them. I love going to them. But I am not so blind to not be able to critique them. And I think that's what is very valuable about people who are deconstructing and wanting to understand this kind of place and this kind of work.
Basically, just to also not homogenize the word museum, not all museums are the same. And there is a lot of discussion right now as we speak on ethical working and ethical being and being otherwise. So museums are not all the same. So basically, thank you. It was a very good answer, but my answer was, where do you put the line? Since you're it was not about disengaging, but do you engage in a museum where but you answered. I mean, yeah. Just so And about this, the Nazi part, what is going on with the documenta, recently, how much Germany sometimes overreacts to situations or not. Like, there is a very big stirring up and discussion right now.
Yeah.
And where do you find yourself in this?
Very shortly.
Yes.
No, okay, but it's very important to be aware of where the line is crossed, of course, but we're also in this kind of era of cancellation and jumping so fast before I don't know, things really settle and then we can discuss them. So I would always keep in mind when I have a critical thought to also let criticism come, and see how people deal with it. It's of course very different from your point of view on this answer, but I'm critical, but I'm also into having these situations that invite conflict in order to talk about them and not to shut them down. But while you're canceling something, an artwork, a person, an artist, it's just muting something that can be very interesting to talk about.
Thank you.
Maybe. So maybe I should talking about these issues. I have a question for Assaf. Being an Israeli artist and working between Tel Aviv and Antwerp, and so today a broad spectrum of artists is standing in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom and supporting the growing international campaign for boycotts, divestment and sanctions. This is known as BDS, against the Israeli state. The boycott, which has been taking place officially since 2005, also exists in the field of contemporary art. It is practiced officially and unofficially, and by a variety of groups within the art world. The boycott includes the refusal of Arab and Palestinian artists to take part in exhibitions abroad that include the works of Israeli artists, and the refusal of foreign artists to show their work in Israel. So the purpose of the boycott, of course, as we can understand, is to raise awareness about the Israeli occupation and the violations of human rights. What is the impact of this BDS movement on the country's contemporary art scene? And are Israeli artists and art institutions severely affected by it? I would like to hear your perspective on that issue.
Obviously, I'm not a politician, which is good for me. I'm not a politician. And regarding the cancellation era, I need to be also cautious here. So I will not get into politics too much, but I can address a little bit about the BDS movement, which is very alive and rising, and it's like a snowball that just gets bigger and bigger. I would say that if the initial purpose of the BDS, I think you also mentioned that, was to raise awareness and two-state solution or equality between Israelis, Palestinians, and all of that, it was lost in translation along the way. It started from a cause that, a small hint, people from the cultural sphere, people from designers, writers, academics, there are more liberal people that are more into making a change and not to just live with the situation and to agree with the situation. So with time, I believe that it was lost in translation into not canceling only, not canceling only the government of Israel or what it stands for, but canceling Israelis, which is very unfortunate because in regard to what I said before, instead of recognizing a problem, listening to that problem, letting this problem breathe, it's just muting them, the people that are involved. Also the positive voices, of course, that aim for a change. It's a very complex issue, and I think that a lot of Europeans have this black and white. I'm talking about the majority or the stereotype. Black and white, right and wrong, weak and strong. And there's so many grays in between. And I did want to say another thing. Yeah, it's a very complex issue. By the way, tomorrow is the 5th election in Israel in the past 3 years, just to show you how much people are trying to change stuff. And it's important to know that muting these voices is putting your head in the ground and actually just reproducing the problem, you know? That's from my okay. Sorry.
One more thing I wanted to add, because it's good to know, like also in the audiences and stuff with the BDS and all this situation that started also with the Chile member. I mean, there are very important people involved from all sides in this. But somehow, recently we saw with the Documenta 15, and it's the idea of many people that the German anti-Semitism, is it mine? German anti-Semitism. Many people from Israel and other people said that this German over not anti-Semitism, the over like thought of like anti-Semitism, not thought. The German anti-Semitism caused this kind of very big trouble. Is very. That's why I brought also before the boundary, because washing the guilt sometimes can become a fascistic issue. So, you know, many people in that boards, many people in that other boards, imagine that for the first time in an exhibition, in an international exhibition like Documenta, we had the president of a country saying who the artist would have been. And that never happened before. Or the curators had to go to the parliament to excuse themselves. So you understand, it's a very topical. That's why I keep saying about vantage points, Confederate monuments, slave trades, the American South, these kind of issues. But in the end, there are shared interest on how this overt, what you were saying, this overt kind of solidarity that some people don't want creates more problems. But thank you for this, and maybe it's time to.
I want to apologize because we started late. We wanted to start at 6:30, so no fault to any of the people on this stage. We're running a little late, so I'd like to continue this conversation, but I also want to give them a chance, since you came, in case you have any questions. Do we have any people that want to ask questions?
Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Elena. I'm an ARCAthens fellow, and I have a question for Anita. First of all, I was curious to know a little bit more of how your experience as an educator has informed your curatorial strategies. And if you allow me, I have a second part that is more specific. I wonder if that makes sense to you. But since you are in the context of Athens, I was wondering what opportunities or possibilities it offers to you and your curatorial practice on critical Black memory and Black feminism to work outside of the US or the Caribbean context, because sometimes the institutions or even the audience is less sensitive or aware, familiar about these issues and this lens. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I think the first part of your question really feeds into the second, in that, you know, because I was an educator for so long, I found myself wanting people to really understand cultural significances in a way that I think would be beneficial, but also in a way that challenges them to really come with these very targeted questions. And so, you know, I really believe that you have to be called to teach. And I was absolutely not that. But I think there are skills that I learned in teaching that has influenced how I approach my curatorial work, like you said. I think that, you know, for the Define the Shadow show, it was very much oppositional to how I had been teaching before, where I would really give resources and want students to understand and come with a lot of enthusiasm about the subject. But with that show particularly, and now in this new trajectory that I'm in, wanting to explore, I'm pulling back a bit in that line. I think people have an obligation, if not a responsibility to themselves, to really want to understand the nature of things, or to want to try to unpack power, or think about books and resources and people that they might continue these conversations with. And that is, not to say that I'm negligent of those concerns, because I think these conversations are very, very valuable. But there's a way in educational systems where people have a tendency to coddle, or to try to, almost paternalize the subjects in which they're trying to teach, right? And that is very much not the way we want to go. The second part of your question about engaging people outside of the Caribbean, the African context, and how that relates to my work, I'm at the initial stages of that still. We've been here 6 weeks now, and I feel like I'm still trying to find the communities that I think will want to learn about this sort of work. I mean, the Afro-Greek community is very much, it sounds like a nascent community. They're finding their identity, they're finding ways to vocalize their concerns. They're 1 or 2 generations removed from the continent in some senses. And, there are theoretical frameworks that travel and translate. So it's not like we're speaking a different language when we're coming to topics such as Black feminism or liberation work, or any other thing that might unite us. But I think there are particularities to the Afro-Greek community and condition that I am not able to parse through at this stage in my journey. I just don't have the rhetoric or the vocabulary to really understand that subject position. But that isn't to say that I don't really appreciate that. And I want to learn more about that. And I think this. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm coming to you.
Hi, I'm Miriam Simon. I'm an artist. This question also is for Anita. Thanks for your presentation. It was really wonderful. I'm really excited about the Where is Africa book. I think it's really important for teachers and students. And also this glissant chart is awesome. I never had seen that before. This question is something I'm struggling with, so it's not at all a challenge. I think I'm just interested, based on all the answers you gave, I think you would have really interesting insight. In thinking about, so maybe you can hear from my accent, I have a US passport. In thinking about how we bring the really important different social justice discourses that are happening in the US, how they get brought out, and talked about, for example, here in Athens, but I think it can also be somewhere else. Something that I think about a lot is where these discourses have made a lot of progress. For example, I think in critical race. I mean, it's not only the US, but let's say that's one of the places where it's pushed forward a lot. How do we think about bringing that to other places in the context of understanding that there is also this existence of an American cultural imperialism, of things being pushed out, under a different political, or a problematic political context, how to just deal with that. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame that.
The progression in for example, critical race discourse in the US, and then bringing it outside in the context that there's also this American imperialist cultural project.
Yeah, I think there are certain ideological frameworks that have been implemented in the US that are very much vital to globalized conversations. And those frameworks are pushing back against those imperialist dynamics. And so even though they're coming from the US, which is embroiled in all of this, imperial, real systemic things that would make it almost negate the power of the cultural products that maybe it's exporting, like critical race theory or like intersectionality. Those concepts almost transcend borders. They do transcend borders. And it's not a matter of people bringing that to a public or like, even having that discourse be, shared in a way that would, uplift the U.S. of a place of these sorts of ideals. And I don't think that it's that. But I also think that, to talk about power is to talk about how ideas are exported and how people are like lashing on to some things that maybe aren't necessarily fully applicable in their cultural context. So if we talk about like intersectionality with Kimberly Crenshaw penning that in 1989, that was coming from a particular framework that is then, getting transposed into a globalized condition. But that isn't to say that it loses its merit because of that exploitation, right? So there are layers to these sorts of conversations, but you can't stop ideas. So it's not a matter of like necessarily pinpointing them in order to, talk about influence in a very strict way, but more so I think it's necessary to contextualize those ideas as related to a condition that's coming from a place. That makes sense. So like if I'm talking about, like in the chart, negritude, negritude is something that has been influential in a number of contexts, in the Black radical tradition, and traditions that are thinking about liberation work and womanism. There are a lot of resonances that are multi-layered and maybe pinpointed through this one term that's an umbrella term, but people have made it their own, and they are like showing permutations that are valuable to them in a way that enhances its original, its originality and its original embeddedness in a situation. So I don't know if that makes complete sense, but yeah.
I appreciate your question because we as an organization that brings up to now only Americans, but you're first non-American Assaf, so thank you for breaking us into a more international perspective. But as an organization that brings American voices, we've thought a lot about what is the difference between issues that can be seen from a universal lens versus issues that are sort of seen through a dominant discourse lens, that being an American lens. So I appreciate your question, and we're thinking about these things very much, and so are our fellows. Adeola Aderemi, who I mentioned earlier, her contribution with Afro-Greeks, I think is specific about not having a voice through an American discourse, but being an Afro-Greek, having site-specific issues and concerns. So thank you for that. Do we have other questions, or do we bring it back to the panel? Anyone else would like to ask something? Okay, so let's wrap it up soon, but if you have some questions that are pending, this is the time.
I don't have any question pending. Just to the last comment, I think as we are critical about everything, it's kind of interesting to think about this universal sort of understanding and focus as something that should cease to exist. Because vantage points and from where we see the rest of the world is quite very, very important. As Greek citizens, as American citizens, the fights we fight, of course there are certain intensities and some things are similar fights, let's say, but they are different, and we have, I think it was Glissant, since you brought him before, that was saying that there is no globalism if we don't consider every single particularity in this world, even without one of these particularities. So for me, it's kind of important to understand that maybe the question is not even American understanding can apply in Europe, even European understanding can apply in America, but to understand that there are very, very many particularities that speak from different vantage points, and of course demand similar things like justice, freedom, economical, justice and freedom, racial justice, and all this.
Respect. That's the word I believe.
Counter respect, but sometimes respect is not enough. You know what I mean? I wish it was, but there's some, of course, respect. So, I think this kind of milliards of particularities is kind of important that Tixan is speaking about when he refers to globalism.
I would have more questions, but I think it's really time to wrap it up, as you said. So
Thank you. So we're going to wrap it up. And thank you everybody for joining us today. I do have just a very short announcement to make. Before we go to the reception, I would like to leave you with some exciting upcoming news. The same day that Anita and Assaf's residency ends here in Athens, begins our ARCAthens residency at EPI, at the Experimental Printmaking Institute in Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. We're excited this year's fellowship recipient is the inimitable Leandra Lesueur, who, have you worked with her before, or is she just a friend? Are you serious? Leandra is an incredible artist. The ARCAthens residency at EPI is an annual program offered exclusively to ARCAthens alumni. This printmaking residency at Lafayette College's Experimental Printmaking Institute serves our past fellows, very specifically, as part of our mission's commitment to the continued support of previous ARCAthens fellows. So as our umbrella of programming grows, we want to have focus on the people we've already worked with. This is part of our mission. So I'm very pleased with this EPI residency. Moving forward, in a couple of months, on January 16th, ARCAthens returns for our spring 2023 Athens residency. We will announce our new fellowship recipients in December, and we anticipate an excellent program as our two upcoming fellows are quite exceptional. So we've got a couple great people following you. Lastly, I wanted to offer you a teaser of our upcoming NOLA BX Research Fellowship. We're designing a pilot program for 2023 where one Greek artist and one Greek curator will have the opportunity to spend 1 month in New Orleans Camp Abundance and 1 month in New York City at our Bronx headquarters as ARCAthens Fellowship recipients. This new program was inspired by you and your requests that the bridge we're building goes both ways. It took little to convince us to move forward with the design of this program, and the entire organization anticipates an excellent pilot. If all goes well, we will be making an open application announcement for 2024 in the summer. So stay tuned. That's it. Thank you so much. Thank you to the museum. Thank you to our fellows, the panelists. Thank you to Atopos and everyone in the ARCAthens family, and you, our community, for joining us tonight. Let's go have a glass of wine.